Thanks very much, Michael. And just some context for this book again, or for this paper rather. The context is the book, and part of the context for the book is the upcoming quote-unquote anniversary of the Reformation. Whatever Martin Luther did to that Wittenberg door in 1517, we have to pay the price in 2017. There are, of course, many conferences already being planned, many books, and in many cases they're very celebrative. And I thought there might be another angle on this. I'm not necessarily a celebrative person by nature, but anyway, so I thought there was something else to come out of it, and so I wanted to have this is why it's like an alternative view. Now, as Michael was saying, the starting point for it then is looking at why it might be that this period sees the emergence of the religious refugee in particular as a mass phenomena. So that becomes the question that I try to pursue through it. I'll warn you that it's an overview, and it's an overview from a pretty high angle. So details get blurred, but I hope it still kind of hangs together in a certain way. The inspiration at a certain point is John Bosse's Christianity in the West, and I guess I would like to think that in a sense this is my homage to Bosse, that in some way that in the same way that his book really transformed the way I thought about this period, that I hope it can be some contribution to rethinking. I will have two parts to this, Microcosm, the first part, which is where I feel more confident. That's where I'm talking about confraternities. And then the Macrocosm, where the bird flies way up into the sky and you have no idea what's going on. So we'll see just how it goes. In 1494, when Florence faced waves of French troops washing down the coast and into Tuscany, Savonarola preached a sermon comparing the city to Noah's Ark, a place of refuge and of promise, as divine punishment swept away sinners. He could have used another image soon to become popular through engraved aerial views, the city as an island, with churches, homes, and monasteries within the walls, and nothing but blank space or open fields outside. This itself would have been the mapped equivalent of a more distinctly religious image, the Madonna of Mercy, or Misericordia, with cloak outspread to protect citizens from the spears and arrows of natural disaster and divine judgment. Ark, island, protective shelter, images of the city as a bounded community with inside and outside sharply distinguished, grew ever more common across Europe through the 15th and 16th centuries. They gave visual and rhetorical form to the idea of the city as a pure and a holy space. They also imposed an obligation on those inside the space to maintain spiritual purity and holiness in order to maintain the protective boundaries. If the community allowed the moral boundaries to deteriorate, disasters like plague and famine could break through and devastate the city and its people. Preachers, artists, and engravers painted verbal and visual images, yet community members put the ideas into practice. One way was by refining the means of identifying and expelling or containing those who threatened the moral purity of the community inside the boundaries. This disciplinary imperative became an important driving factor in lay spirituality through the 15th and 16th centuries. Historians often associate discipline with Protestant church orders and Catholic reform movements, yet deeper shifts in mentalities emerge in observance movements of the century before. Observance first linked ideas of purity, contagion, and community, and fed a thrust towards radical purgation that reshaped lay piety from the 15th century. This was one dimension of what I think we can see as distinctly Renaissance religion. Tracking lay piety is critical here, since we are not following just a few intellectual changes, but a spreading civic religious mentality or ethos that spanned church and state. Confraternities provided one avenue for research. Confraternal statutes and membership records show three stages through which confraternal devotions and discipline become steadily more about what people are than what they do. I will focus on the Italian cities of Bologna and Modena from the 14th to the 16th centuries. 14th century confraternal statutes set very general standards for admission and communal life. In 1317, Bologna's San Francesco required members to keep away from gambling and bad practices and obey company officials. There was no disciplinary process, in part because there was not much communal life. This was Bologna's largest confraternity, with well over 3,000 male and female members, perhaps 5% of the total population. It shaped their spiritual life via light obligations for daily prayers and opportunities to perform charitable work in the large pilgrim hostel. This was what we could describe as a first stage of loose community, which we also see in many other 14th century confraternities, like Santa Maria della Carità, which gained influence after reforming itself during the 1399 Misericordia movement. Even after 8 decades and the stimulus of a new devotional movement, the Carità confraternity adopted almost verbatim a version of San Francesco's statutes, adding only prohibitions against blasphemy and against swearing on the body and blood of Christ. In a second stage, from around the 1440s, observant mendicants began engaging more intensely with Bolognese confraternities. They stimulated reforms, new foundations, and collective devotional activities. Both Dominican and Franciscan brotherhoods worked to protect their confraternal community's moral purity. In the early 1440s, the Company of San Domenico tightened its regulations, while the Company of San Francesco established a subgroup to allow members to organize their spiritual life around either observant devotions or hospital charity. Both these subgroups were more explicit about the higher moral standards expected of members. It wasn't enough to be individually pure. Members had to shun the contagion of others' immorality. Confraternity statutes expanded the list of prohibited activities. Don't practice illicit arts like making playing cards. Don't practice usury. Don't engage in infamous, dangerous, or scandalous activities like sodomy or adultery. Don't keep a concubine. Don't blaspheme or use bad language. Avoid bad companions who might tempt you to sin. Gamblers, tavern owners, tavern goers, others of low condition. Neither women nor boys under 15 could join these groups, again because of the temptation they represented, and this was a critical change, since Bologna's earlier confraternities had emphasized the gathering of women and men, young and old. Members of this new Franciscan subgroup were now more beholden to the community of their brothers. They had to obey its officials and keep its secrets, and they were bound to observe the full range of its extensive spiritual exercises and mutual obligations. But it was not all prohibition. These groups aimed to practice together a more deeply emotional piety, framed around the imitation of Christ, particularly his passion, and exercised through flagellation, foot washing, frequent worship, and daily prayer. They were small, selective, and demanding. What distinguishes these statutes of the second stage from earlier ones is the care taken to preserve the community's purity. They recruited new members more selectively, trained them more intensively, and then expelled them when they failed to live up to standards. Earlier confraternity statutes had included only vague provisions allowing officials to expel members. Both the Dominican and Franciscan observant confraternal statutes of the 1440s made the standards and procedures for expulsion more explicit and effective. They encouraged members to inform on their fellows, set out distinct penalties for first, second, and third offenses, and allowed a return only if the violator confessed his fault and changed his behavior. The timing of the new Franciscan confraternal statutes was particularly significant. They were written in 1445, just 2 years after the Franciscan order had almost split in two, after the conventuals reacted violently to Eugenius IV's efforts to appoint an observant as Franciscan Master General. The observant friar Bernardino da Siena brokered a peace deal that kept a conventual as Master General. Although it cost him considerably with his own supporters, this model of accommodation and compromise offered an example of peacemaking that Bolognese laymen then followed. Bologna's existing confraternity of San Francesco, with its thousands of male and female members, its hospital, and its relatively relaxed membership standards, stayed within the conventual church of San Francesco, with the conventual friar as its spiritual father. In 1445, the small group separated and established a distinct group of their own in the local observant Franciscan house of the Annunziata, taking one of its friars as their spiritual father. They kept the name of San Francesco, and the two groups distinguished themselves as San Francesco Larga and Stretta, the Larga being conventual and the Stretta observant. This was simple enough, but things soon got more complicated. When preaching in Bologna in 1422, Bernardino da Siena had reformed older confraternities that often changed their name or focus considerably. The most prominent was known as Buon Gesù, after his devotion of the Holy Name. It had changed his name to Buon Gesù. Bernardino was well known locally as observant. Yet after his death and rapid canonization in 1450, the Larga Francesco confraternity of men and women at the conventual house of San Francesco established a new Larga confraternity in San Bernardino's name and honor, although notably without adopting his stricter observant discipline. What resulted must have been a little confusing even to contemporaries. Bologna by the mid-15th century then had two separate confraternities with the name of San Francesco, one conventual, one observant. It also had two confraternities dedicated to the memory of the observant friar San Bernardino da Siena, and again, one conventual, one observant. Stretta observant brotherhoods dominated confraternity reform in mid-15th century Bologna and indeed through much of Italy. They underscored discipline, conviction, and exclusivity as markers of identity with the spiritual cause of imitating Christ's suffering, and these were the most influential drivers of later change. In 1459, Bologna's oldest confraternity, Santa Maria della Vita, spawned its own devotional stretta group, which adopted the observant San Francesco statutes, some parts verbatim, others with a few modifications. Through its influence, half a dozen other confraternities quickly followed suit. All adopted stricter standards of purity, all exercised cautions against bad and contagious influences, women, young boys, gamblers, blasphemers, tavern goers. This was a movement seen across Italy, and it's important to remember that these groups were not large and inclusive. Stretta confraternities were often small, but they exercised disproportional social and spiritual influence because they tended to recruit professional and elite members with significant social capital to invest in broader change and a motivation to do it. The concern with purity and contagion increased in the third stage from the late 15th century, when devotion and discipline intensified around concerns of identity. In 1510, the observant Franciscan confraternity of Bon Gesù that I mentioned earlier instituted changes that marked the first emergence in Bologna of some of the stricter disciplinary and devotional forms associated with Catholic reform. The familiar list of faults meriting expulsion expanded significantly, with two defects at the head of the list: heresy and rebellion against the church. There followed a longer list of those individuals to be excluded by virtue of their origin, profession, or identity: pimps, actors, singers, magicians, murderers, practicing Jews, thieves, practicing lawyers. Just the same thing, right? Like women and young boys, these men were excluded by definition as contagious agents who disturbed the purity of the confraternal community. The statutes advised members not to be too judgmental and fault-finding, but then also intensified the procedures for judgment and fault-finding, with clear instructions for identifying, judging, and expelling errant brothers. Once annually, each member met with the spiritual father to go over the entire matriculation list and report on the faults of each other brother individually. The spiritual father then called in each brother again to start a process of correction that could end up in expulsion. The chief faults were failures to respect the corporate life of the brotherhood, failing to take the sacraments, obey the officials, maintain the peace, or offer mutual aid, and above all, failing to respect the privacy and secrecy of the brotherhood and its oratory. Members had keys so they could use the oratory for personal devotions. Sharing a key, admitting a stranger, or allowing that stranger to read the statutes without permission could lead to expulsion, because members were to maintain the privacy and secrecy of the bounded space of the confraternal oratory. As for devotional regulations, members of the Bon Gesù Stretta pledged themselves to pray more frequently, to post images of San Francesco and San Bernardino in their homes, to follow, so this is the domestic devotions, and to follow spiritual exercises of the Imitatio Christi adjusted to their degree of literacy and their working lives. The statutes adopt the common observant theme that would soon become a Reformation trope for both Catholics and Protestants. They idealized the fervor and devotion of the primitive church and decried the negligence, frailty, and moderation or tepidity of more recent times, which had caused all religious orders, congregations, and confraternities to decline from their original purity. The confraternity was turning ad fontes with a vengeance, using new disciplinary and devotional regulations to perfect community by eliminating the contagion of immorality and advancing the purity of an intense spiritual life. Three sets of statutes, 14th century, mid-15th, early 16th century. We can see a steady increase of the rhetoric on purity, contagion, and community. It's not simply that immoral members are impure. Their immoral acts, and then increasingly their very identity, prevents others in the brotherhood from realizing their own devotional purity. This intensifies the emotional nexus between discipline and devotion. The earlier statutes excluded people for what they do. The later ones come to exclude them for what they are. They aren't just bad in themselves, as we see in the 14th century. They aren't just bad in their pollution, as we see in the 15th. They are bad for the contagious effect they have on others. They should be removed for the good of the brotherhood, to allow other brothers to realize their potential as a pure community in that bounded space. If the community is an ark, these ones have to be thrown overboard to prevent the whole ship from sinking. Now, thus far, the reading of the statutes, and we had asked as responsible historians, what does it all mean? Because statutes they're both boring and misleading, and we really have learned long since to take them as a guide to much. But I think there is something we can get out of this. Was this just a Bolognese phenomenon? And more to the point, did any of these regulations ever find a life off the page? First of all, it wasn't simply a Bolognese phenomenon. In Modena, we find a similar development in the 11 confraternities founded from the mid-13th to the mid-16th century. 3 emerged in the 13th and 14th century, all drawing male and female members, all closely related to charity and hospitals, all having general expectations about members' morality. 4 then emerged in a second stage in the mid-1420s under the direct influence of Bernardino da Siena, who preached in Modena in 1423. All of these had the far stronger devotional expectations we saw in the Bolognese observant confraternities, including flagellation. All had far stronger disciplinary provisions, including expulsion of members who failed to meet an explicit and rigorous moral code, who disobeyed the officials, or who were negligent in spiritual exercises and obligations. Some banned women for the first time and established clear procedures for getting rid of the morally contagious member. One group allied with the Dominican observance and one with the Franciscan observance, but the greater clerical influence seems to have been the Benedictines of the House of San Pietro. So there was a kind of a local dynamic as well. Finally, 4 groups founded in the late 15th and early 16th centuries offered charitable services and observant-style devotional and disciplinary reform. They recruited much more selectively and expelled those who undermined the community. Now, it is one thing to write stiff disciplinary regulations and another to actually throw members out. So the question is, did it ever really happen? And in the period we're looking at, it most certainly did, at least in those brotherhoods for which we have matriculation lists. In the Modenese groups just noted, an average of 1 member in 5 was expelled through the 15th to the mid-16th centuries. San Pietro Martire shed a quarter of its members from a 1439 reform to the mid-16th century, while San Erasmo, which is one of the 4 confraternities immediately associated with the Bernardine observant movement, expelled 40% of all its members from its origins until 1552. Bologna had far more confraternities and a far wider variety of results. Santi Girolamo Erana expelled 25 of the 106 members recruited in its devotional revival of the 1440s, and then 25% again of those recruited in a second revival of 1492 to 1501. Santa Maria della Carità, first reformed in 1399, then again in 1518, expelled 31% of the new members it attracted. Santa Maria della Morte Comforters, the Conforteria, who assisted prisoners condemned to death, adopted new statutes in 1555, which included for the first time a censor who checked into members' morals, and within 6 years it expelled half its members. John Henderson estimated that one Florentine confraternity expelled 16% of its members annually, most of them from among the newest recruits. And we see this pattern in confraternities across Italy whose membership records are extant. Expulsions did ease off considerably in Modena, Bologna, and Florence by the later 16th century, when devotional currents shifted once again, and when confraternities became more often parish auxiliaries whose work and membership were tied more closely to the spiritual and charitable needs defined by the local priest and bishop. So at this point, that's the microcosm, looking at disciplinary impulses in a couple of cities around confraternities. And I'd like to then move to the macrocosm of discipline, enclosure, and purgation. And this is closer then to the broader themes that come out in the book. Now, at the heart of the 3 stages that I've tracked in confraternal statute provisions and disciplinary actions is an obsession that's omnipresent in the organized religious life of the 16th and 17th centuries. Some define it as discipline. I would suggest that we intensify this by recognizing that it includes or extends to purgation. Purgation was the most contentious element of many disputes in religious groups across Europe through the first half of the 16th century. It resonates through all of the rhetoric of certainly of the religious reformers of the North, but also in the South as well. This purgative rhetoric, which I think is very important, which we sometimes take as just rhetoric. I think we have to stop and ask how much it is just words. Whatever we think of the reality or success of confessionalization or Christianization, we can recognize that all religious communities within Christendom obsessed over purity. They multiplied the efforts and tools that protected their purity from contagion, from confessions and catechisms to enclosure and expulsion. Joseph Kaplan and Tiana Kirstich have shown us that the same forces exist within contemporary Jewish and Muslim communities. The devotional and disciplinary impulses are more closely intertwined by the 16th century than they were in the 14th. That directs attention to the 15th century to understand how and in what forms the emphasis on purity, contagion, and community take ever sharper definition. One expression of that, as I mentioned earlier, is that more people are being thrown out of communities, not just for what they do, but for what they are, which I think is an important development of essentialist identities and action on those essentialist identities. Disciplinary developments within lay confraternities and within Christian churches of all confessions are usually the result of lay clerical collaboration. Church and state collaborated on the common project of building a holy society, a corpus Christianum. We saw a steady intensification of the rhetoric on purity from the 14th to the mid-15th to the early 16th centuries. I think, of course, we have to remember that when R.I. Moore first talks about the origins of a persecuting society much further back, I'm not saying that this is different from it, but that we're seeing, I think, an intensification of it. The emerging conviction among Bolognese and Modenese confraternities is not simply that immoral members bring the rest of the group into disrepute. That's a common and a banal complaint. Now their immorality prevents the rest of us from realizing our devotional purity. It then becomes their very identity and presence that is the problem. In this emerging essentialist scapegoating, we move from actions to identity as the marker of contagion. We also move from loose entrance or admission requirements to more refined procedures for identifying and removing impure members before their contagion spreads within the group. Joseph Kaplan has shown that this also becomes steadily more important for some metropolitan European Jewish communities as they attempt to deal with the phenomenal growth driven by new arrivals from across Europe, including often forced converts like the Iberian conversos who reclaimed the Jewish faith and communal life after moving to Amsterdam. There was a period of the 17th century where the Amsterdam city government has to talk to the leaders of the synagogue to say, don't expel so many of your members. It's causing social unrest. Not everyone can be expelled. Another means of dealing with impure, alien, and contagious presences is to enclose. In its first stages, enclosure is usually less about discipline and punishment than about piety and purification. This is certainly the case with early enclosures for foundlings, orphans, the poor, nuns, reformed prostitutes, abused women. All of these kind of enclosures emerge in the 15th and 16th centuries, often administered by confraternities with the aim of sheltering the needy. An enclosure of the Jews was, for these same communities, a natural next step. Almost all the charitable enclosures become more disciplinary within a few decades. Once institutional structures are in place, the sense of what one can and should do with them shifts from shelter to reform. I'll return to Bologna for just one telling example. Bologna opened Italy's first permanent poorhouse as a civic enclosure outside the city walls in 1563. One model came from enclosures for foundlings and orphans, opened through the previous century. Another came from Bologna's enclosed ghetto for the Jews, a few blocks in the center of town that were bordered and sealed off in 1556, then reinforced in 1566 before the Jews were expelled from the city entirely in 1569. When the poor were first expelled from the city and sent to the civic poorhouse outside the walls in a procession in April 1563, they were marched on a very particular route, deliberately, past the new Jewish ghetto, down a route that took them past 2 enclosed convents, 1 enclosed monastery, and an enclosed girls' orphanage before they exited the city gate and walked a further kilometer down the road and into their own enclosure, which was a former monastery and pest house. Purgation and enclosure worked together as these poor were moved out beyond the walls of the Bolognese community and then into a new enclosure. Now, Bologna's orphanages and poorhouse were the work of confraternities acting together with the civic government. Both saw them as progressive examples of religious reform in continuity with the ghetto, a mechanism for containing impurity and then for converting what was impure into what could become pure and Christian. They represent on a civic level the move from identifying harmful and impure actions to identifying harmful, impure, or contagious individuals, and then either enclosing or expelling them, or both, in an act of communal purification. The Bolognese did not hate or fear the poor in 1563, yet those emotions grew once the poor had been isolated, gathered, expelled, and enclosed. What began as actually a largely positive poorhouse, and their problem in the 1560s was keeping people out. They had too many people wanting to get in. So what began as largely positive became a workhouse within a decade, and then a disciplinary prison by the early 1600s. And there's a similar progression in workhouses in Genoa, Florence, Venice, London, Amsterdam. Savonarola's ark, like the Madonna of Misericordia's cloak, was a bounded space. I've argued that this sense of bounded space and the efforts to purify it are critical parts of the observant ethos that spreads from the clergy to lay religious groups through the 15th century, and that starts to shape a civic religious ethos and political action by the 16th. My examples are local, but this movement is a Renaissance legacy that we can trace across Europe and beyond. It's a movement that puts some people on the defensive, puts many people outside the walls, and sometimes on the road as religious refugees, where exile and flight shapes their thinking, their literature, their language, and their social life. Practical separation becomes ever more emotional distance, with the other community becoming an increasingly fearful and threatening presence, not by virtue of what its members do, but simply because of what they are. And it's because of these connections that I would argue that purity, contagion, and purgation are central elements in the discourses of the late medieval Reform movement, and in the discourses of Renaissance religion, and of early modern Reformation Protestantism and Catholicism. We see them in religious movements like observantism and mysticism. And then discourses move into actions with the accelerating purgations of the late 15th and 16th centuries. We see it in the schismatic tendency that connects together the observant ruptures of the 14th and 15th centuries, the Jewish expulsions through the 15th century and then culminating in the 1490s, and in the host of ecclesiastical ruptures which multiply across Europe in the 16th century. It's worth noting that many German towns that expel the saints and the Mass from the 1520s, when they quote-unquote joined the Reformation, had expelled the Jews from the 1460s and 1470s. There's a continuity or progression of purgations here, although it's one that's seldom remarked upon by Reformation historians. Religious exile was a defining experience for many individual religious thinkers and for many religious groups from the Renaissance onwards. Religiously driven migration and diaspora, above all in the early modern period, are defining experiences for many of Europe's migrant groups and became central to their invented traditions and their imaginary. They flowed in large numbers across the Atlantic to Central and South America, around the Mediterranean to the Ottoman Empire of North Africa, overland to Eastern Europe and Russia, even more distantly to parts of Asia. Many dreamt of returning, many tried. Not all were seeking toleration and freedom, but most were at least seeking to avoid very real pressures of conversion and purgation or enclosure. Many would later shape their group identity and invented traditions around the experience of religious exile, even if they themselves hadn't been exiled. I think that's the important part about how the invented traditions come to dominate people's thinking. And my point here is one of framing. If we reconceptualize early modern religion around purity, contagion, and purgation, then we must consider how these values emerged in and shaped later medieval and Renaissance religious culture. We move the exile experience closer to the center of the dynamics that shaped thought and practice. And we move those who have been treated as marginal actors in that drama, like Jews and Muslims, closer to the center stage of a historical period like the Reformation. This reframes the influence of Renaissance on Reformation. It may recast our understanding of that later period's dynamics and meaning. Reformation and the Reformation are not just an in-house drama between groups of Christians, but draw Jews and Muslims to center stage. The Renaissance and Reformation remain critical periods for the development of the Western world, or the modern world, sorry. Only now it's not the Hegelian liberal Western world shaped by secularism, intellectual freedom, and representative political institutions. It's the modern global world shaped by colonial and post-colonial legacies of exclusionary essentialism, of forced conversion, of religious and racial purgation, or of forced and involuntary migration. It's a world where purity, contagion, and purgation drive mobility, religious community, and identity. It's a world we recognize now. This is the world that the next generation of historians comes from, and this is the one that we will hear from in the years ahead. Thanks very much.